The world, millions of years ago, was a strange and dangerous place. A world untouched by the hands of time, where massive mountains were still shaping themselves and oceans roared with power. It was a time when Earth's creatures were in their infancy, their fates unwritten and yet to be discovered. At this very moment, in the deep dark corners of ancient lands, something extraordinary was about to happen. The very first eggs of what we would come to know as dinosaurs began to crack open. This wasn't just any ordinary birth. This was the birth of something entirely new. From these eggs, creatures would emerge that would change the course of life on Earth forever. The story of dinosaurs began in the most fragile of forms. An egg, soft and yet firm enough to hold the potential of an entire species. As the sun's first rays peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows over the warm, humid earth, the eggs began to stir. Beneath the soft shell, life was moving, tiny creatures covered in soft membranes, shifting, stretching, and readying themselves for the harsh new world outside. The warmth of the earth, the heat of the sun, and the distant rumblings of unknown creatures outside all came together to signal the arrival of the new life. Inside these eggs, life was stirring, one crack at a time. Slowly, a small hard beak broke through the shell, piercing the world that had protected it for so long. A fragile creature emerged, blinking its large, still sleepy eyes, attempting to make sense of the world it had just entered. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and the faint noise of others could be heard. Their first day of life was marked by the chorus of other hatchlings, struggling their way free. The world outside was vast and wild. It wasn't a place of safety, it was a land ruled by the unknown. Yet for the hatchling there was an immediate sense of wonder. The air was heavy with the smell of wet moss and the earthy scent of ancient trees as they stretched high into the sky, their branches reaching like fingers to touch the clouds. Above, the sky was dark, almost oppressive, as storm clouds began to gather, darkening the atmosphere and adding a sense of urgency to this fragile moment of birth. The young hatchlings instinctively knew that the world they had just entered was one full of mysteries, but also peril. They were small, so small in fact that their first instinct was not to explore but to hide. The ground around them was alive with movement. The foliage trembled with the passing of something far larger than them, sending ripples through the dense underbrush. Tiny sounds, unrecognizable to the untrained ear, were omnipresent, a constant reminder that danger could be close. But it was also a world of awe. These first breaths of life were accompanied by the overwhelming sense of newness. The first time their legs wobbled beneath them as they tried to stand, and the world seemed just a little too large, a little too intimidating. It was during these moments that the instinct of survival began to form in the young minds of these dinosaurs. Nature, in all its glory and terror, had provided everything they needed to survive, from food to shelter to protection from predators. The parents, sometimes a distant presence and at other times an essential protector, hovered near their newly hatched young. Some species were more social than others, and the young found comfort in the presence of siblings or the protective arms of parents. Others were left to fend for themselves, the harshness of the world already pressing down on them. Though the specifics of the first few moments of life may never be fully understood, one thing is clear: the struggle to survive began as soon as those eggs cracked open. As the hatchlings found their footing, instinct took over, pushing them to follow their parents or stay hidden depending on the species. The world outside the egg was full of dangers. Giant predators lurked, while natural elements such as sudden storms could drown them in minutes. But there was also opportunity, a chance to grow, to feed, and to discover what it meant to truly be alive. Historians and paleontologists still argue over how exactly the first dinosaurs emerged into the world. Was it all at once in a massive simultaneous hatching across the Earth, or was it a gradual unfolding of life, taking millions of years for these creatures to truly dominate the planet? One thing is certain, these first dinosaurs, fragile as they were, mark the beginning of an era that would last for millions of years, shaping the Earth in ways that no one could foresee. The first day of life of these hatchlings was just the beginning of an epic journey, a journey filled with awe, fear, and the drive to survive. This was their world, and it was up to them to carve a place in it. They were born to become giants in both size and legacy, but in these early moments, as they blinked their eyes against the light and felt the world for the first time, they were only the tiniest of creatures, just beginning their story. As they took their first shaky steps on the rich, damp soil, their senses heightened. The rustle of leaves above, the shifting of the ground beneath, and the cool breath of wind all carried whispers of the world they had entered. It was a land filled with mystery and excitement. For the first time in their lives, they were free from the confines of their eggs and had a world to explore, a world that would both shape and challenge them in ways they could never imagine. Despite their small size, their instincts were sharp, as was the need to adapt. They could feel the warmth of the earth beneath them, offering the first comfort in their new existence. The sun broke through the clouds, casting bright golden rays across the jungle-like landscape. It was a world filled with newness, beauty, and the terror of the unknown. The young hatchlings, though unsure, could feel the pulse of life all around them. They were not alone, of course. Other creatures had already made their marks upon the earth. Some were predators, huge, powerful creatures with sharp teeth and claws that moved with terrifying speed and strength. But there were also other dinosaurs, herbivores, large and slow-moving, whose gentle grazing and peaceful ways created a stark contrast to the violence of the predators. In this new world, every moment was one of learning. Each step the hatchlings took, each new sound they heard, was a chance to gain wisdom, a chance to survive in a world that was both wondrous and hostile. But for now, their first day was a quiet one. They were still too small to venture far, still too fragile to explore fully. Their first steps were tentative, as they clung to the safety of their nests and the comfort of familiar smells and sounds. The world was vast, but it was also full of promise. The young dinosaurs could feel it in their bones. They were part of something bigger, something that would shape not just their lives, but the very future of the Earth itself. The air outside the egg was thick, humid, and vibrant with the energy of a world just waking up. It was a strange sensation for the young hatchling, the first breath of a life yet to be lived fully. With every gulp of air, its tiny chest expanded, the lungs filling with the breath of the earth itself. Yet it was not just the air that pressed upon them. The weight of their surroundings was felt in every step, in every sound, in every moment of vulnerability. The first breath wasn't merely a physical necessity, it was a symbolic gateway into a world of struggles and discoveries. The hatchling, still wet from its emergence, looked around with wide, unblinking eyes. There was so much to take in, the towering trees with their thick trunks, the dense foliage that hung heavy with moisture, and the creeping shadows cast by the rising sun. The world was large and frightening. The sounds were unfamiliar and unsettling. The chirps and roars of creatures in the distance, the rustling of leaves as wind moved through the canopy, and the sudden sharp calls of birds and insects. Even in the calm, there was an ever-present undercurrent of danger, of nature's unpredictability, waiting to manifest. The hatchling instinctively sought shelter, its first step into the unknown. guided by the primal need to survive. Its legs were unsteady, and every movement felt like an effort. But instinct too was strong. It knew that it needed to move, and so it ventured, shaking off the remnants of its shell as it scuttled toward the safety of a nearby thicket, where thick ferns and tall grass offered the promise of protection from larger, more dangerous creatures. It was in these moments of struggle, the first struggle to stand, to breathe, to take in the world, that the foundation for survival was laid. The first moments were fragile, delicate and uncertain, but each breath, each step was a small victory. It was here in the very early stages of life that the young dinosaurs learned the importance of resilience. Even when their tiny legs buckled beneath them, even when the overwhelming world seemed like too much to bear, the drive to survive kept them moving. They weren't alone in this world. Around them, in the thick underbrush, other hatchlings were facing the same challenges. Some scrambled to find their footing, their movements awkward and unsure, while others managed to steady themselves more quickly, clinging to the shadows and seeking comfort in the presence of their siblings. Some sought the shelter of their mother, whose watchful eyes scanned the surroundings, ever vigilant for threats. She stood protectively over her brood, offering a sense of security, though even she was wary of the dangers lurking just beyond the protective undergrowth. The mother, with her keen sense of alertness, observed every movement. The young ones had barely emerged, and already the instinct to protect them was overpowering. They weren't ready to defend themselves, none of them were. Their physical capabilities were still raw, still in the process of development. They were still too small, too vulnerable to face the dangers of the world on their own. The mother's role was clear. She was their shield, their guide, their constant in this chaotic world. She would remain close, keeping an eye on any movement, any change in the air, and any sign of approaching predators. Her every action was dictated by the need to keep them safe. Her instincts were just as sharp as the young ones, but hers were honed by years of experience, knowledge that was passed down from the generations before her. As the hatchling took its first breaths, its tiny body shaking in the cool air, it learned quickly that this was only the beginning of its journey. The first breath wasn't just about the expansion of the lungs, it was about awareness. Awareness of its surroundings, awareness of danger, and awareness of the fact that every single breath taken was another step towards survival. But survival wasn't only about escaping danger, it was also about growth. The young dinosaurs, though fragile, were born with the potential to become formidable creatures. Their small legs would grow stronger, their senses sharper, and their bodies would adapt to the world around them. Each day would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to become something greater than they had been the day before. But for now, the first breath was enough. It was a moment of awakening, a reminder that life, though uncertain and fragile, was something worth fighting for. Though the immediate threat of predators loomed, the early moments of life were still filled with wonder. As the hatchlings began to grow accustomed to the world outside the egg, they discovered that the earth itself was a source of life. The small creatures that scuttled along the ground, bugs, lizards, and other early inhabitants, became their first source of food. The hatchling's instincts told it to explore, to nibble on whatever it could find, to fuel its body for the long journey ahead. Every tiny bite was an accomplishment, a step towards self-sufficiency. But the world was unpredictable, and even as the hatchling ventured further into the shadows of the thicket, the constant pressure of survival loomed over it. There was always something bigger, something stronger out there. The young dinosaur could hear the distant roars of massive creatures and the crack of branches being snapped under heavy feet. Predators, always lurking, were never far away. It was in these first few days that the hatchling's survival skills would be tested. Its first breath had led it to this world of wonder and danger. But now, with every step it took, with every moment it spent in the outside world, the reality of survival became clearer. The first day was filled with struggle, but it was also filled with hope. The hatchlings were fragile, yes, but they were born with a deep well of instinct, one that would serve them well as they learned how to survive in this ever-changing world. Each new breath they took brought them closer to the day when they would no longer be babies, no longer hatchlings dependent on their parents for survival, but creatures in their own right, powerful and strong, capable of standing against the harsh world that surrounded them. In the first moments of their lives, the young dinosaurs knew little of the vastness of the world outside. Instead, they found comfort in the shadows. These early days were spent within the safety of hidden corners, sheltered from the dangers lurking beyond. Their lives, though brief, were focused on learning, growing, and becoming something more. The nursery, as it was a place of learning, security, and the constant presence of instinct. The world beyond their nest seemed enormous, a sprawling landscape teeming with life and death, but the small dinosaurs were not yet ready to face it. Instead, they remained close to where they had hatched, near the warmth of their mothers and the safety of the earth that had cradled them since the first breath. The thick ferns and dense underbrush provided the perfect cover, a natural nursery where life could begin, unfurling slowly as they grew. For the first few days, their world consisted of the comforting scent of wet soil, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the quiet sound of their mother's footsteps nearby. She kept watch, a vigilant protector in this treacherous world. Her role was clear: to keep them safe and to teach them the first lessons of survival. She was ever present, her senses honed by years of navigating the dangers of the wilderness, and now she passed this knowledge on to her young. The nursery was not a place of play, but of preparation. Here the small dinosaurs learned how to move cautiously, how to recognize danger, and how to find the first sources of nourishment in a world that could change in an instant. The young dinosaurs' instincts drove them to seek shelter, hiding beneath the thick fronds of ferns and within the hollowed-out trunks of ancient trees. These places provided protection from the predators that roamed nearby, always on the lookout for an easy meal. The hatchling's survival, at this point, depended on staying hidden, on being quiet and out of sight. Though they were instinctively curious, they were not yet bold enough to venture far from their mother's protection. Instead, they watched the world from the safety of the underbrush, observing the movement of creatures much larger than them. They could hear the growls and roars of predators, the calls of strange creatures in the distance, but they were kept safe for now, safe in their nursery of shadows. In the early days, their mothers played a crucial role in protecting them. They taught their young not only by guarding them, but also by demonstrating how to find food. The nursery was full of small, easy-to-catch creatures that could sustain the hatchlings during their earliest days. These first meals were crucial for their growth, providing them with the energy needed to develop and survive. The hatchlings would follow their mothers, observing closely as she found insects, small plants, or even the carcasses of larger animals that could provide nourishment. The younger dinosaurs, still too weak to hunt on their own, learned the art of foraging, observing every movement with the sharp eyes of a budding predator. At times, the mother would leave her young for short periods, testing their ability to stay hidden, to rely on their instincts in her absence. It was during these moments that the hatchlings would feel the pulse of fear, the awareness that their survival was in their own hands now. The absence of their mother was never long, but it was enough to encourage growth. It forced the young dinosaurs to practice hiding, to quiet their breathing, to stay still until she returned. The nursery was no place for noise, no place for movement. If the predators were to find them, it would mean death. Yet within this nursery of shadows, the dinosaurs were not entirely passive. Their instincts for survival were already developing, setting the foundation for the creatures they would eventually become. Even at this young age, there were small tests of strength. A sibling might challenge another to a brief wrestling match, not out of malice, but out of a deep-rooted need to understand boundaries, to learn how to protect oneself. These small conflicts were natural, an instinctive part of growing up. It was here in the nursery that the early foundations of both social and individual survival were built. Though the nursery was a place of calm, it was not entirely free of threats. As the young dinosaurs grew stronger, their senses sharpened, and they began to perceive the real danger that surrounded them. The skies above, once a distant source of wonder, were now filled with creatures that could swoop down in an instant. The trees, once their shelter, were no longer safe. The massive reptiles, predators that ruled the land, would sometimes stalk near the nursery, drawn by the sounds of movement or the scent of fresh prey. It was during these moments of danger that the role of the mother became even more vital. Her deep guttural calls would signal the young to remain hidden, to be still and silent, to blend in with their surroundings as best as they could. The nursery was a space of contrast. It was a place where the young dinosaurs began to understand the dual nature of the world they inhabited. On one hand, it was a world of nurturing, of care, where the young were protected and taught. On the other hand, it was a world that demanded vigilance, a world where the difference between life and death could be determined by a moment's hesitation. The lessons learned in these first days in this nursery of shadows would stay with them for the rest of their lives, shaping their instincts and behaviours. As they grew stronger, their physical skills developed alongside their mental awareness. Their legs grew sturdier, and their muscles became more defined. The hatchlings, once so delicate and unsure, began to experiment with movement, testing their strength by stretching their legs and pushing themselves beyond the safety of their sheltered home. It was a moment of transformation, a sign that they were ready to face the world beyond the nursery. Their senses became sharper. They could detect the faintest rustle in the grass, the slightest disturbance in the air. The sounds of other creatures became more distinct. Even the faintest echo of a predator's movement sent ripples through their awareness. In the nursery, they had learned to become quiet, to blend into their surroundings. But as they matured, they also began to realize that staying hidden was not always enough. At some point they would need to confront the dangers of the outside world, perhaps sooner than they had hoped. In these early days there was no rush. Life moved slowly, at its own pace, and the young dinosaurs had time to learn. The nursery was their safe space, a world within a world, where they could grow without fear of the outside world, even as it loomed ever closer. It was here, in these early moments, that the foundations of survival were laid, through lessons of patience, of quiet observation, of protection, and of strength. The young dinosaurs were beginning to outgrow their delicate beginnings. Their bodies, once so fragile, were now gaining strength. Their instincts, once dormant, were beginning to awaken, and with this growth came the inescapable feeling of hunger, the kind of hunger that would drive them forward, pushing them from the safety of their nursery and into the wild world beyond. They were no longer content with merely lying in the shadows waiting for their next meal. It was time to learn how to find food, to feed the growing hunger within them. The world was vast and its bounty was spread out before them. The first feast was not something they had planned for, not something they could have foreseen. It was a matter of survival, a moment that arrived naturally, as their growing bodies demanded more energy. The moment they ventured outside the safety of the nursery, they were greeted with the sounds of rustling leaves, the vibrations of small creatures skittering through the underbrush, and the distant calls of prey. The hatchlings, though still unsteady on their feet, could feel the pull of the world around them. The scent of food was in the air, and the call of hunger was louder than ever before. At first their efforts were clumsy. Their legs, still wobbly and unsure, carried them only a short distance before they stumbled. But the hunger was too strong to ignore. It wasn't long before they began to observe the world in a new way, searching not just for shelter but for something to eat. Their small eyes, once wide with confusion and fear, became more focused. They began to notice the patterns of life around them, the smaller creatures moving through the undergrowth, the way the larger plants bore fruit, and the sound of rustling leaves that often signalled the presence of prey. Their mother was ever present, always watching, always guiding. She had already begun teaching them how to forage. It was a delicate balance, finding food without making themselves vulnerable to predators. She would lead them to areas where smaller creatures lived, where the hunt was easier. There they learned to search for small insects or tiny plants that they could consume. At first the food was unremarkable. Insects were small and hard to catch, and the plants provided little sustenance. Yet they were enough to sustain them as they grew. Each tiny bite added to their strength, fueling their bodies and preparing them for what was to come. The young dinosaurs began to understand that hunger was a constant companion. There was no rest from it. It pushed them to explore, to search, and to fight for their next meal. They learned that they had to be patient, to wait for the right moment, and to be silent when hunting. The young ones, once shy and cautious, were beginning to develop the skills they would need to survive in a world that was full of both opportunity and danger. But the hunger, insatiable and constant, kept them focused, kept them moving. The first feast was not limited to the small creatures that scurried through the underbrush. The young dinosaurs were quick to observe the larger animals around them. They watched the herbivores graze, moving in herds, their massive bodies slowly munching on the plants. There were lessons to be learned here: how to graze, how to find food in the wild, and how to avoid the predators that lurked nearby. The young dinosaurs watched these larger creatures with both awe and fear. They knew that in order to grow strong they would need to become like these creatures, able to feed themselves, to stand tall, and to navigate the challenges of the world. But the world was not kind to the young, and the first feast was also a reminder of the violence of nature. As the young dinosaurs ventured further into the wild, they quickly learned that food did not come without its risks. The predators that stalked the land were always near, always looking for an opportunity to strike. The sound of a twig snapping in the distance was enough to send the hatchlings running, ducking into the nearest cover. The larger, more dangerous creatures were always watching, always waiting for their chance to hunt. The first feast, though important for their survival, was also a reminder of the delicate balance of life, a balance that could tip at any moment. The young dinosaurs, still inexperienced and unaware of their own strength, were easy prey, but they were also learning how to protect themselves. They had already begun to rely on the safety of their mother, who was always there to shield them from danger, but as they grew, they would need to learn to fend for themselves. The first feast was only the beginning of a lifelong struggle to feed themselves, to fight for what was theirs. At first, their meals were small insects, small plants, and the occasional morsel from a larger animal. These early meals were just enough to keep them going, to fuel their growing bodies. But as time passed, they began to seek out larger and more substantial meals. The instinct to hunt began to awaken within them, a deeper, more primal urge. They would follow the movements of the herd animals, learning to track their prey, to anticipate their movements. They would wait quietly into the shadows, watching as the animals grazed, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. The first hunt, though still far in the future, was already beginning to take shape. The young dinosaurs were no longer mere observers. They were becoming active participants in the cycle of life. They were learning how to feed themselves, how to survive in a world that demanded everything from them. Each day brought them closer to their next meal, to their next test, and to the next chapter of their lives. The hunger that drove them was not just a need, it was a force that shaped them, that pushed them to grow, to become stronger, and to understand the rhythms of life. Their world, once a vast and intimidating place, was slowly becoming more familiar. The young dinosaurs were learning how to navigate it, how to understand the signs that nature left behind. The first feast was not just about food, it was about growth. It was about learning how to survive, how to become something more than just a fragile hatchling. The hunger that had once seemed like a simple need was now a driving force, pushing them forward, shaping their destiny. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land, the young dinosaurs sat together, their stomachs filled with the small victories of the day. They were no longer the fragile creatures they had been when they first hatched. They were becoming something greater, something stronger, and as the darkness crept in and the stars began to shine above, they rested, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more hunger, and more lessons to learn. The cycle of life was just beginning. As the young dinosaurs continued to grow, the once solitary experiences of their early life began to change. The nursery, once a place of quiet protection and individual learning, gave way to the more social aspects of survival. It became clear that this world was not one in which a single creature could survive alone for long. The early days of isolation had passed, and now the dinosaurs began to form bonds with one another. These connections, forged out of necessity and instinct, were the first steps toward building the complex social structures that would help them survive in the dangerous world they inhabited. Herds began to form. While some species were solitary by nature, others found strength in numbers. The young dinosaurs learned that by banding together, they could protect one another from the threats that loomed over them. A group, no matter how small, provided a certain level of safety, as the more alert individuals could warn the others of predators, and there was strength in numbers when it came to foraging or defending territory. In the beginning, the social bonds within the group were tenuous. The young dinosaurs were still learning to navigate the world and each other. The early friendships were based on proximity, sharing the same space, staying close to one another, and seeking protection from their mother and other members of the group. There was no complex social structure, but the instinct to remain close to others, to form a bond for mutual survival, was innate. The young dinosaurs instinctively understood that by sticking together, they could increase their chances of survival. The bonds formed in these early days were often simple but necessary. The young dinosaurs would learn to communicate with each other through sounds, low growls, chirps, and other vocalizations, and through body language. These early signals were the first steps toward the more complex communication systems that would develop over time. By sharing space and food, they began to understand the value of companionship, even if it was just for a few hours or days. The young dinosaurs would often huddle together in the shadows, forming loose groups that moved together, seeking shelter and protection. They were still fragile, still vulnerable to predators, and thus their survival depended on their ability to rely on one another. The mother dinosaurs, though busy with their own survival and protection, were not unaware of the importance of social bonds. They understood that their young needed more than just food and shelter. They needed companionship, a network of support that would help them grow stronger. They would encourage their young to stay close to one another, guiding them toward one another in moments of danger or uncertainty. The mothers also formed bonds, though these relationships were more focused on the safety of the group rather than on individual affection. The bonds within the herd were built on shared experiences, shared dangers, shared food, and shared threats, and they would serve as the foundation for a more complex social system in the future. As the young dinosaurs continued to grow, they began to experiment with social interaction in new ways. Playful wrestling matches between siblings or peers became common as they tested their strength, honed their physical skills, and learned about their own limitations. These early competitions, though not violent, were important in developing the skills they would need to survive. It wasn't just about hunting and foraging, it was about establishing dominance, understanding the rules of the group, and learning when to stand your ground and when to back down. These early friendships weren't always without conflict. Like all young creatures, the young dinosaurs sometimes quarreled over territory, food, or attention. These small skirmishes, though often harmless, were important lessons in social dynamics. In the wild, there was only so much food to go around, only so much space to share, and the young dinosaurs quickly learned that to thrive, they would need to navigate these challenges. The conflicts they experienced were the first steps toward understanding power dynamics and hierarchy, which would play a crucial role in their survival as they matured. As they grew older, their social interactions became more complex. The young dinosaurs began to form more structured groups. Some groups were led by the strongest, the most assertive individuals, while others were more egalitarian, with members relying on mutual support and cooperation. These groups provided more than just physical protection. They offered a sense of security, a sense of belonging. The young dinosaurs began to rely on one another, to help each other find food, to warn one another of danger, and to share in the joys and struggles of the world they inhabited. These early friendships were essential to their survival. They provided the young dinosaurs with a sense of community, a sense of place in a vast and dangerous world. The bonds they formed in these early days would shape their behavior for the rest of their lives. As they matured and learned to navigate the complexities of the world, these friendships would serve as the foundation for their social roles in the herd, their approach to hunting, and their interactions with other species. The bonds of the herd were tested as the young dinosaurs faced new challenges. The world was constantly shifting, and there was always the threat of predators lurking nearby. The young dinosaurs learned that the safety of the group was paramount. It was during these moments of danger that the strength of the herd was most apparent. The young dinosaurs would huddle together in times of stress, their bonds strengthening as they faced the common threat. The predators that lurked in the shadows could be terrifying, but there was comfort in knowing that they weren't alone. The young dinosaurs found safety in numbers, just as their mothers had taught them, and it was this strength that would carry them through the many challenges ahead. In time, the social structure within the herd became more defined. The young dinosaurs learned to work together, to help one another, and to support each other in ways that would help them survive in the harsh world around them. The bonds they had formed were no longer simple. They had evolved into something more complex, more vital. The young dinosaurs had learned the value of cooperation, the importance of trust, and the necessity of protecting one another in a world full of predators, competition, and uncertainty. The first friendships, the bonds of the herd, were the foundation of a social structure that would continue to grow and evolve as the dinosaurs matured. These bonds were essential to their survival and would guide them through the dangers of the wild. In a world where survival depended on strength, cunning, and unity, these early friendships provided the young dinosaurs with the support they needed to face the challenges of life head-on, and it was through these friendships that they learned one of the most valuable lessons of all: that in a world of danger and uncertainty, the best way to survive was together. As the young dinosaurs continued to grow, so did the world around them. The early days of safety and shelter, where the nursery had offered them protection, began to fade. The reality of the wild world they inhabited was becoming more apparent, and with that realization came the presence of danger. It was during these formative years, when the young dinosaurs were still developing their survival skills, that they first encountered the terrifying roars of the predators that roamed the land. The sound of a predator's roar was unlike any other. It was a deep guttural sound that shook the very earth beneath their feet. It was the sound of power, of something immense and deadly. For the young dinosaurs, the first roar they heard was an awakening, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. The predator's call pierced the stillness of the air, sending ripples of fear through the group. It was a sound that signified danger was near, that something far larger and more powerful was watching them. At first, the young dinosaurs didn't fully understand the threat. The sound was frightening, but they had no real concept of what it meant. They'd been protected by their mothers and had learned the ways of the world in the safety of the nursery. But the time had come for them to face the harsh truth. The world was not a gentle place, and survival was never guaranteed. The predators were always nearby, always waiting for an opportunity to strike. The first encounter with a predator was a terrifying one. The young dinosaurs were grazing in a small clearing, their senses still somewhat unrefined, when the first predator appeared. It was a massive carnivorous creature, its teeth bared, its eyes locked on the young group. The predator was patient, moving with quiet precision through the tall grasses. Its presence, though not immediately obvious, created an eerie tension in the air. The young dinosaurs, oblivious at first, continued to feed, unaware of the imminent danger. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the predator emerged from the grass. The ground trembled as it charged toward the young dinosaurs, its roar deafening in the stillness. Fear gripped the young creatures as they scattered in every direction, their instincts kicking in as they fled for their lives. The predator was fast, its powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying force. Its eyes locked on the nearest target, a young dinosaur that had been too slow to react. The first real test of survival had begun. The young dinosaur, unable to outrun the predator, dove into the thick underbrush, seeking refuge in the shadows. It was a small victory, but it was enough to escape the immediate threat. The predator, frustrated by the loss of its prey, turned away, but the danger was far from over. The young dinosaurs huddled together, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing with the realization that they had narrowly escaped death. The predator had tested them, and they had failed. But there would be other chances, other opportunities to learn how to survive. In the aftermath of the encounter, the mother dinosaurs were quick to gather their young, guiding them away from the open spaces where the predator had attacked. They were no longer safe in the wide open plains, where the predators could easily spot them. The lesson was clear. The young dinosaurs would have to become more cautious, more aware of their surroundings, and more capable of defending themselves if they were to survive. The predators were always out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next opportunity. This first encounter with danger was a turning point. The young dinosaurs, though frightened, began to understand the rules of survival in the wild. They learned that there was no such thing as absolute safety, and that the predators were always a threat. The predators, once distant figures in the background of their world, were now a tangible, terrifying reality. Their roars would haunt the young dinosaurs for days to come, reminding them of the ever-present danger that lurked just beyond the safety of the herd. But the young dinosaurs were not without their own strengths. They began to learn the importance of vigilance, the necessity of staying alert to the sounds and movements of the world around them. They understood that they couldn't rely solely on the protection of their mothers. They had to develop their own skills, their own methods of survival. As the days passed, they became more adept at sensing danger, more attuned to the sounds of the predators that stalked the land. They learned to move quietly, to hide in the shadows, and to use the terrain to their advantage. It was a slow process, but each day brought them closer to the strength they needed to face the dangers that awaited them. The roar of the predator, though terrifying, was not the only danger they would face. As the young dinosaurs grew stronger, they encountered other threats, rival groups of dinosaurs, fierce territorial disputes, and the constant threat of environmental challenges. The predators, with their sharp claws and powerful jaws, were the most immediate threat, but the world was full of dangers that demanded attention and caution. Every step taken in the wild was a calculated risk, a chance to survive or fail. The young dinosaurs began to form a new understanding of the world. They realized that survival was not just about running from danger, it was about learning how to navigate the complex web of life. They learned that they needed to be more than just fast or strong, they needed to be clever. They needed to use their environment, their senses, and their instincts to outsmart the predators and to find food, water, and shelter. As the young dinosaurs continued to grow, the roars of the predators became a constant reminder of the risks they faced. But they also became a symbol of strength. The predators were powerful, yes, but the young dinosaurs were not without their own power. They were learning how to fight, how to defend, and how to survive. The predators would come, but the young dinosaurs were no longer the helpless creatures they had been in the nursery. They were becoming something stronger, something more capable of surviving in a world where only the fittest survived. And so, as the young dinosaurs moved forward, the roars of the predators no longer filled them with fear alone. They knew they would encounter these creatures again, but they also knew that they were no longer helpless. They were becoming predators themselves, sharpening their instincts, developing their strength, and forging a path through the dangerous world that surrounded them. The world was harsh, unforgiving, and full of threats, but it was also a place where life could thrive, if you were strong enough to survive. The young dinosaurs were no longer the fragile hatchlings they had been. They had grown in both size and resilience, their muscles becoming more defined and their instincts sharper with each passing day. The struggles of their early life had shaped them, teaching them the value of survival and the need for strength in a world that demanded it. But growth came at a cost. The transition from helpless babies to powerful, self-sufficient creatures was not easy. It was a journey marked by growing pains, both physical and emotional, that would forge them into the creatures they were destined to become. The first signs of strength were subtle at first. The young dinosaurs began to stand taller, their once wobbly legs now steady and firm. Their bodies were no longer so delicate, and their sharp teeth began to grow in, replacing the soft, underdeveloped ones they'd been born with. The early hunger they had experienced, the constant drive for food, was now matched by their need for strength. Their bodies demanded sustenance, and they learned that to grow stronger, they needed to hunt more effectively, to find more substantial sources of nutrition. They could no longer rely solely on the small creatures they had once foraged for. They needed larger meals to sustain their growing bodies. The growing pains were not only physical. The young dinosaurs also began to feel the weight of their responsibilities as they ventured further from the protection of their mothers. They could no longer hide in the shadows, dependent on others for survival. They had to learn to fend for themselves, to navigate the world as independent creatures. The social dynamics within their herds began to shift. The bonds they had formed as hatchlings were no longer enough to guarantee their safety. They had to prove their strength, both individually and within the group. It was a time of competition and testing as each dinosaur vied for its place in the hierarchy of the herd. The young dinosaurs were beginning to understand that survival was not just about physical strength, it was also about adapting to the challenges that came with their growing size. The environment itself began to change. As they matured, the landscape they had once known so well began to present new obstacles. The rivers, once shallow and easy to cross, now presented deeper, stronger currents that could sweep away even the strongest of creatures. The dense forests that had once provided safety and shelter were now filled with new threats, new predators that had adapted to the changing world. The young dinosaurs had to evolve not just in terms of strength, but also in their ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment. The physical changes in their bodies were undeniable. Their legs grew longer, their necks stretched upward, and their jaws became more powerful. They began to move with more confidence, their once awkward gait now replaced by a smoother, more efficient stride. The muscles in their legs, backs, and tails grew stronger, preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead. The powerful legs, once used only for running, began to develop the endurance needed for long-distance travel. Their bodies, now capable of covering vast distances, gave them the ability to explore more of the world, though this also meant encountering more dangers. The young dinosaurs began to experiment with their newfound strength. They tested their limits by pushing themselves harder, running faster, and exploring further into territories once avoided. They discovered that they were capable of feats they hadn't even imagined. They could outrun some predators, and with their stronger jaws and teeth they could fend off smaller threats. But with this power came greater risks. The more they tested their limits, the more they encountered new dangers, larger predators, rival groups, and territorial challenges that required more than just strength to overcome. It was during this period of growth that the young dinosaurs began to understand the true cost of strength. As they matured, they became more aware of the dangers that came with it. They realized that their newfound size and power made them more vulnerable to certain threats. Predators that had once been a distant danger now posed a real challenge. Larger, more powerful creatures could easily overpower them if they weren't careful. The growing pains of their strength were not just physical, they were also emotional. The young dinosaurs began to feel the weight of responsibility as they moved further away from the protection of their mothers. They had to learn to make decisions on their own, to navigate the world without the constant guidance of a protector. As they grew, they also began to learn about the importance of teamwork. The bonds they had formed earlier in life, though still strong, became more complicated as they matured. The once innocent friendships they had formed were now marked by rivalry, as each dinosaur vied for its place in the group. The competition for food, territory, and mates became more intense. They learned that strength alone was not enough. They needed the support of their peers to survive. It was in these moments of competition and camaraderie that the young dinosaurs learned the value of collaboration. The strongest individuals often had the most to gain, but even the strongest needed the support of others to protect themselves from the dangers of the wild. The young dinosaurs, now fully aware of the dangers around them, had to learn to balance their growing strength with caution. They could no longer afford to act impulsively or recklessly. Every decision mattered. The strength they had gained was their greatest asset, but it was also their greatest vulnerability. They had to use it wisely, for every moment of overconfidence could be their last. The world they inhabited was one of constant testing, where the smallest mistake could lead to their downfall. As the seasons changed and the young dinosaurs matured, the growing pains they had experienced gave way to a new sense of purpose. They had become powerful, resilient creatures, capable of surviving in the harshest of environments. Their strength had been earned through struggle, through competition, and through the lessons they had learned. But with this strength came a new understanding of their place in the world. The world was vast, full of danger and opportunity. They had the power to shape their fate, but only if they learned to navigate it wisely. The growing pains of their youth had forged them into creatures of strength, but it was the lessons they had learned, the balance of power, caution, and the importance of community that would guide them through the rest of their journey. They were no longer the small, helpless creatures they had been. They were giants born of struggle, forged by the wild, and destined to leave their mark on the earth. As the young dinosaurs matured, they began to feel the pressure of a world that was not just about surviving, but about finding a place in it. The early days had been spent in the safety of their nursery, under the watchful eyes of their mothers. But as they grew stronger and more independent, the harsh reality of the world outside became undeniable. It wasn't enough to merely survive. The young dinosaurs had to carve out a place for themselves in the sprawling, chaotic landscape that stretched before them. Territoriality became a key aspect of their development. No longer content with simply following their mothers and the herd, they began to explore areas further afield, areas that they would need to defend. The world was full of resources, food, water, and shelter, but these resources were not infinite. Other creatures roamed the land seeking the same things. The need for space, for territory, became increasingly important as the young dinosaurs grew older. They began to notice the subtle signs of territorial boundaries, scent markings on trees, the tracks of rival dinosaurs, and the occasional confrontation that would make it clear who held dominion over a certain area. At first, the young dinosaurs didn't fully understand the concept of territory. Their early years had been about staying close to their mothers, about forming loose bonds within the group, but now that they were stronger, they could see that there was much more to life than just following the herd. It wasn't enough to be part of a group. They needed to secure their own space, their own place within the world. This was a new challenge. It wasn't just about avoiding predators or finding food, it was about asserting themselves in a world that constantly demanded more. The first sign of this new reality came when the young dinosaurs encountered a rival group. The confrontation was subtle at first. A few exchanged glares, a few low growls, and some posturing, but it was enough to make the young dinosaurs realize that their place in the world was not guaranteed. The other dinosaurs, though not much older, were already beginning to assert dominance, making it clear that certain areas of the landscape were off limits. For the young dinosaurs, this was a pivotal moment. They could either back down and retreat into the safety of the herd, or they could stand their ground, ready to defend their claim. The first confrontation was a test of strength. The young dinosaurs had spent their early years growing, gaining power and endurance, but they had never truly faced an opponent who could challenge them. The rival group of dinosaurs was larger, and the older members were more aggressive. The young dinosaurs quickly learned that the stakes were higher now. They weren't just competing for food or space, they were competing for their very survival. The challenge wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The young dinosaurs had to learn to assert themselves, to project strength, even when they didn't feel it. The first fight was a cacophony of growls, stomping feet, and snapping jaws. The young dinosaurs, though hesitant at first, soon found their courage. The battle wasn't about brute force alone, it was about strategy, about knowing when to charge and when to retreat, when to display dominance and when to bide time. It was a complex dance of aggression and submission, of testing limits and learning how far one could push before the consequences became too dire. In the end, the young dinosaurs didn't win the battle through sheer force. It was their ability to adapt, to learn quickly and act decisively, that allowed them to secure a place in the world. They didn't claim the entire territory for themselves, but they earned the right to live in the space they had chosen. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. The young dinosaurs had learned that in the wild, it wasn't always the strongest that triumphed. It was the smartest, the ones who knew when to fight and when to let go, the ones who could read the subtle signs of dominance and challenge them. Territoriality was not just about physical space, it was about the psychological battle of dominance. The young dinosaurs learned that asserting their place in the world meant more than just defending land. It meant understanding the social dynamics of the other creatures around them. The territory they had fought for was now theirs, but it came with a new set of rules. They couldn't simply rest on their laurels. They had to defend their space against future challenges, maintain their position in the social hierarchy, and ensure that they could continue to thrive. As the seasons changed, so did the young dinosaurs. They were no longer the curious hatchlings that had wandered the underbrush in search of food and shelter. They were growing into powerful creatures, capable of surviving on their own, capable of defending themselves and asserting their place in the world. Their interactions with others, whether they were rivals or allies, became more complex, more nuanced. The fight for territory was never-ending, and the young dinosaurs had to remain vigilant, always ready to defend what they had earned. In time, the young dinosaurs learned that territoriality wasn't just about physical boundaries, it was about establishing a presence. They began to mark their territory in subtle ways, leaving scent markers on trees or rocks, using their size and strength to dominate certain areas of the land. The once simple social structure of their group began to evolve into something more sophisticated. Dominance was no longer determined by size alone. It was about influence, about who commanded respect from others, and who could maintain their position at the top of the hierarchy. The young dinosaurs also began to realize that finding one's place in the world wasn't just about asserting dominance over others, it was about finding balance. It was about understanding their own strengths and weaknesses, and knowing when to assert power and when to compromise. They learned that territoriality was not a one-time battle. It was an ongoing process, one that required constant vigilance and adaptation. Their place in the world was no longer something to be taken for granted. The young dinosaurs had to work for it, to fight for it, and to maintain it. But they had learned something essential during this process, that their strength lay not just in their physical power, but in their ability to adapt, to learn, and to understand the world around them. In a world filled with challenges and danger, the young dinosaurs had discovered that the true measure of strength was not just the ability to conquer, but the ability to survive and thrive amidst the complexities of life. As the young dinosaurs grew older, their focus began to shift from the constant struggle for survival to the more complex and urgent demands of reproduction. The time had come to face the drive that all creatures experience, the call of nature, the urge to find a mate, to continue the species and to ensure the survival of their bloodline, became an unavoidable reality. Mating rituals, though often subtle and filled with competition, would determine not only their future, but the future of their species. The first stirrings of this urge were faint at first, like a whisper in the back of their minds. As the young dinosaurs matured, they began to notice the differences between themselves and the others in their herds. The males became larger, their bodies more muscular, their movements more assertive. The females, on the other hand, became more aware of their physicality, aware of the role they would play in the continuation of the species. The once simple relationships between herd members began to evolve, becoming charged with new energy and new urgency. What had once been a peaceful existence was now infused with the presence of competition and desire. The first signs of mating behavior were subtle. The young males began to display their strength more frequently. posturing and showing off their physical prowess. They would stretch their necks tall, make deep, resonating calls, and use their powerful limbs to assert dominance over others. These displays were not just a demonstration of physical strength, they were an invitation, a challenge to other males to prove their worth. The females, in turn, would observe these displays carefully, weighing their options as they watched the males. The strongest, the most dominant, were the ones that caught their attention, but the females also considered other factors: intelligence, endurance, and the ability to protect and provide for the future of their offspring. Mating rituals varied between species, but they all shared one common feature: competition. The males competed fiercely for the attention of the females, each trying to outdo the other in strength, speed, and skill. This was not a simple mating process. It was a battle for the privilege to pass on one's genes. The young dinosaurs, now aware of this new phase of life, began to test their abilities. The males would engage in mock fights, using their sharp claws and powerful tails to wrestle each other to the ground. These displays were not only a test of physical strength, they were a demonstration of resolve, of the ability to withstand pain and push through adversity. The females watched carefully, selecting the strongest males, the ones who could endure the most, the ones who would offer the best chance for survival to the next generation. But mating was not always just a competition of strength. The dinosaurs, with their growing intelligence and emotional depth, also engaged in more subtle forms of communication during the mating process. Some species, for example, would engage in complex vocalizations using deep calls, chirps, and even growls to communicate their intentions. The sound of these calls would travel through the air, carried on the wind, and heard by potential mates from great distances. The young males learned quickly that these calls could carry weight. An impressive roar or an intricate call could make all the difference in attracting a mate. The females, on the other hand, would respond with their own calls, signalling their readiness to mate, or perhaps rejecting the advances of a male they deemed unworthy. The younger members of the herd, still growing and learning, watched this process with a mixture of awe and confusion. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they felt the pull of the urge, the deep instinctual drive to find a mate of their own. The timing of this urge was as much a part of their development as their growing strength and survival instincts. They knew that eventually they too would need to find their place in this ritual, to prove their worth and to pass on their own genes to the next generation. As the mating season approached, the dynamics of the herd began to shift. The males became more aggressive, more eager to assert their dominance. They fought harder for the attention of the females, and the once peaceful, cooperative nature of the group was replaced by a more competitive atmosphere. The females, in turn, became more discerning, carefully evaluating the males, not just based on their physical strength, but also their ability to protect and provide. It was not just the strongest that would win the right to mate. It was the male who could offer the best chance of survival to the offspring. The females understood that the future of the herd depended on their choices, and they took the responsibility seriously. The competition could be brutal. The young dinosaurs began to learn that there was no room for weakness, no room for hesitation. The ritual of mating was an essential part of the survival of the species, and each dinosaur had to prove their worth. The males would challenge each other in fights, pushing their bodies to the limit, battling for the attention of the females. The fight was not just physical, it was a test of endurance, of patience, and of strength of character. The females, watching from the sidelines, would select the males who demonstrated the best qualities: the ability to fight off threats, to defend their territory, and to offer the best chance of a strong, healthy future for their offspring. At the height of the mating season, when the air was thick with the sounds of calls and roars, the ritual culminated in the final selection. The females would choose their mates based on the displays they had witnessed, their strength, their resilience, and their ability to overcome the trials of life. The males who had survived the challenges, who had proven themselves worthy, would then mate, continuing the cycle of life that had begun millions of years ago. For the young dinosaurs, the process was not yet complete. They were still growing, still learning the ways of the world. But the mating rituals of the adults left a lasting impression on them. They understood that one day they would face the same trials, the same challenges, and that they too would have to prove their worth. The urge to mate was powerful, and it would eventually come for them all. But for now, they continued to grow and learn, preparing for the day when they would take their place in the ritual of life. The mating season had passed, and the young dinosaurs had witnessed firsthand the complexities of the rituals that govern their lives. The battle for dominance, the tests of strength, and the call of nature had all led to one undeniable truth. The cycle of life would continue, and the next generation was on the horizon. With the mating completed, the females began to prepare for the most vital role in their lives, the creation of the next generation of dinosaurs. The legacy of life would be passed on, not just through the physical traits of strength and endurance, but also through the knowledge and instincts that would be passed down from mother to offspring. As the females laid their eggs, the focus shifted from the present to the future. The process of reproduction was both a physical and emotional challenge. For the female dinosaurs, the task was monumental. Their bodies had to adapt, shifting their energy from their own survival to the survival of the next generation. The eggs they laid were the potential for new life, a promise of what was to come. The world outside, full of danger and uncertainty, would be the first test of the new generation's strength. But the eggs, for now, were a symbol of hope, a beginning that would eventually lead to another cycle of life. The role of the male, now complete in the mating rituals, became one of support. The males had proven their worth by securing the mating rights, and their role was now less prominent. The female, now carrying the potential for new life, would provide all the care and protection needed for the eggs. Though there was always the risk of predation, the instincts of both the mother and the father guided them toward places of relative safety, hidden caves, nests deep in the underbrush, or areas that provided shelter from the wind and the predators. The passage of time after the mating season was filled with a new sense of anticipation. The young dinosaurs, who had once been the hatchlings in the safety of their mother's care, were now growing and learning what it meant to take part in the next cycle of life. They observed their mothers with keen eyes, watching every movement and absorbing the lessons of survival, protection, and care. The passing of the legacy wasn't just about the birth of new life. It was about preparing the next generation for the challenges they would face. The mother dinosaurs, in their quiet vigilance, began to focus on the task at hand, safeguarding the eggs, the warmth of the earth, the constant attention to the nest, and the periodic shifts in their surroundings were all part of the natural rhythm of life. But the eggs were fragile. The slightest disturbance, whether it be from a predator or the shifting of the elements, could cause them harm. The mother's role was to ensure the safety of the eggs until the day they would hatch. But there were dangers that could not be avoided, and the threat of a predator hunting for the vulnerable eggs was always present. As the days passed, the young dinosaurs who had once been on the fringes of the herd now watched in growing anticipation. They could see that the females were not just incubating eggs, they were incubating the future. Every day spent near the nest was a lesson in survival. The young ones learned about the delicate balance of life. They saw that survival was not guaranteed. No matter how strong one became, no matter how well one defended one's territory, the future was always in question. The eggs, though full of promise, were fragile, and the predators who roamed the land could destroy them in an instant. Yet the mother's resolve was unshakable. She would guard the eggs with her life, for they were the continuation of everything she had worked for. They were the key to the future. The young dinosaurs, who had once watched their parents with curiosity, now began to understand the full weight of responsibility. They had seen the males fight for dominance, and they had watched as the females carried the weight of the future. Now they understood that one day they too would have to protect the next generation. They would have to stand their ground, protect their territory, and ensure that the cycle of life continued. The hatching of the eggs was a moment of great anticipation. The eggs, now buried beneath layers of protection and warmth, were slowly developing. The young dinosaurs, still growing, waited. The familiar sounds of the world outside, the wind in the trees, the rustling of leaves, the calls of predators filled the air. But now there was a new sound, the faint tapping of a beak against the shell of the egg. The young dinosaurs could hear it, and with it came a sense of wonder and awe. It was the beginning of a new life, a new generation that would carry on the legacy of the species. As the eggs began to crack open, the world outside shifted. The young dinosaurs, who had once been fragile hatchlings themselves, now looked on with awe and anticipation. They had grown, and now they would witness the continuation of life. The first hatchling, struggling to emerge from its shell, symbolized the continuation of everything they had known. The struggles, the triumphs, and the enduring strength of the species. The hatching was not an easy process. The young dinosaurs pushed and prodded against the hard shell, their tiny beaks striking the surface with rhythmic taps. The effort was exhausting, and the newborns were not immediately capable of surviving on their own. Their first moments were filled with vulnerability. The world outside, which had once seemed so large and intimidating, was now the place they had to navigate. For the mother dinosaurs, the hatching of their eggs was a bittersweet moment. It marked the beginning of the next chapter in their lives, but it also signaled the end of an era. They would no longer be the sole protectors of their young. The newly hatched dinosaurs would have to learn to fend for themselves, to survive in the wild. The responsibility would now be passed to the next generation, and the cycle of life would continue. The mother's work was far from over. She had to ensure that her young ones grew strong, that they learned the ways of the world, and that they would be ready to face the challenges ahead. As the new generation of dinosaurs took their first steps into the world, the legacy of their parents lived on. It was a cycle that had repeated for millions of years, a cycle that would continue for generations to come. The young dinosaurs, now with their first taste of freedom, would one day grow into the same creatures who had once nurtured them. The legacy of strength, survival, and resilience was passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that life would continue in this harsh, beautiful world. As the young dinosaurs grew stronger, the world around them continued to change. The seasons turned, and with each passing cycle the landscape shifted, presenting new challenges and opportunities. The young dinosaurs had spent their early years in relative safety, learning from their mothers, observing their surroundings, and slowly gaining the skills they needed to survive. But now the real test was upon them. The seasons, with their unpredictable weather patterns and shifting resources, demanded adaptability. This was a world in constant flux, and only the most resilient creatures would thrive. The first noticeable change was the shift in the climate. What had once been a warm, temperate environment now grew colder with the onset of winter. The lush green forests, which had once provided ample food and shelter, began to wither as the temperatures dropped. The once abundant vegetation began to die off, and the land grew barren. Water sources, once abundant, became frozen and inaccessible. The animals that had once flourished in the warmth of the summer began to retreat, migrating to warmer climates or hibernating in caves. The young dinosaurs, still adjusting to the harsh realities of the world, had to learn how to cope with these changes. Their growing bodies demanded more food, more sustenance, and the shifting seasons meant that the food they'd once relied on was no longer as abundant. They had to learn how to adapt, how to move with the changing landscape, and how to find new sources of nourishment in a world that was slowly becoming more difficult to navigate. The first test came when the young dinosaurs encountered a harsh winter storm. The once familiar landscape was now covered in snow and the cold air bit at their skin. The trees, once full of leaves, were bare and lifeless. The rivers, which had once provided fresh water, were now frozen solid. Food was scarce, and the once vibrant world had become a frozen wasteland. The young dinosaurs, unsure of what to do, huddled together for warmth, following their mothers as they led them toward shelter. The shelter they sought was found in the form of caves and dens, natural refuges that offered protection from the elements. These caves, though cold and dark, became their new home for the duration of the storm. They huddled together in the darkness, relying on each other for warmth and comfort. The storm outside raged for days, with the wind howling and the snow piling up in thick drifts. The young dinosaurs could feel the weight of the world pressing down on them, the harshness of nature pushing them to their limits. They had never experienced such an extreme change before, and the world they had once known seemed distant and unreachable. But the young dinosaurs were not without their strengths. They had been born with the instincts and abilities they needed to survive. As the storm raged on, the dinosaurs huddled together, waiting for the worst of it to pass. Their mothers, ever watchful, kept them safe and calm, their instincts guiding them through the storm. They knew that this was just one of the many challenges they would face in their lifetime, and that their ability to adapt would determine their survival. When the storm finally subsided, the world outside was unrecognizable. The once green forests were now covered in a thick blanket of snow, and the familiar sounds of the world, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the sounds of small creatures moving through the underbrush were replaced by the eerie silence of winter. The young dinosaurs, though still unsure of what to do, could sense that it was time to move. The cold had driven away many of the creatures they had once relied on for food, but there were still sources of nourishment to be found. The young dinosaurs learned to dig beneath the snow, searching for buried plants and insects that had survived the storm. It was hard work and it was slow, but it was enough to sustain them. The young dinosaurs soon discovered that winter was not the only season that brought with it the need for adaptation. As the ice began to melt and the days grew warmer, the land began to change again. The spring rains came, filling the rivers with water and flooding the plains. The young dinosaurs learned that the world they lived in was constantly changing, and that each season brought with it new challenges. The warm spring months brought new vegetation, new life, and new opportunities for survival, but it also brought with it the threat of flooding, predators, and disease. The dinosaurs learned to move quickly, to seek higher ground when the rivers began to rise, and to be wary of the new dangers that lurked in the changing world. With the changing seasons came the emergence of new creatures. The young dinosaurs soon discovered that the world was full of life, and that the key to survival was learning how to coexist with the creatures around them. Some animals were predators, and others were prey. The young dinosaurs learned to recognize the signs of danger, to sense the presence of predators before they were seen, and to move quickly when threatened. They learned to communicate with each other, warning one another of danger and signaling when it was time to retreat. They learned that survival was not just about strength, it was about cooperation, observation, and timing. As they grew, the young dinosaurs began to develop new skills that would help them thrive in this ever-changing world. Their hunting abilities grew sharper, and they learned to track prey more effectively. They discovered new sources of food, both plant and animal, and learned how to exploit their environment to their advantage. They learned how to hide from predators, how to use the terrain to their advantage, and how to conserve energy during the colder months. The changing seasons were not just a physical challenge, they were a mental one as well. The young dinosaurs had to learn how to plan ahead, how to prepare for the worst, and how to anticipate the needs of the future. The harsh winters, the flooding springs, and the scorching summers all taught them valuable lessons about the fragility of life. The seasons were a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, that each day was a gift, and that every choice mattered. The young dinosaurs grew stronger with each passing season. Their bodies adapted to the changes in temperature and terrain, and their instincts became sharper. They learned to hunt more effectively, to protect themselves more efficiently, and to adapt to the shifting rhythms of the land. But more importantly, they learnt that survival was a constant process of adaptation. The world was always changing, and they had to change with it. As the young dinosaurs continued to grow, the seasons taught them one final important lesson. Survival was not just about brute strength. It was about understanding the world, anticipating the changes, and adapting to the challenges that came with each new season. The seasons of life were long and unpredictable, but the dinosaurs had learned to survive them through resilience, through cooperation, and through the deep, unwavering instincts that had carried them through the trials of their early years. As the young dinosaurs continued to grow and adapt to the rhythms of life, the world around them began to shift in ways that they could not have anticipated. They had learned to survive through the changing seasons, to defend their territories, and to find food in a world full of both opportunity and danger. But as they matured, they began to realize that the world was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The familiar threats they had once known, predators, rivals, and the elements, were not the only dangers they would face. New and unforeseen challenges were rising on the horizon, and they would have to adapt once again. The first sign of these new threats came in the form of shifting environmental conditions. The land, once teeming with lush forests and open plains, began to change. The weather patterns became more erratic, the rains heavier, and the temperature shifts more extreme. The land itself was beginning to show signs of wear, the once fertile soils becoming parched and cracked in some areas, while in others, flooding waters washed away the plants and animals that the dinosaurs had once relied on. The seasons, which the young dinosaurs had learned to navigate, now seemed unpredictable, as if the very fabric of their world was unravelling before their eyes. The changes in the environment did not go unnoticed. The young dinosaurs, now more aware of the world around them, began to realise that the food they had relied on was no longer as abundant. The herds of prey animals they had once followed were moving in different directions, seeking new sources of food and water. The familiar paths they had once travelled were now blocked by rising waters or dense, overgrown vegetation. The young dinosaurs were forced to adapt once more, learning how to forage in new areas, how to track prey through unfamiliar terrain, and how to find shelter in a world that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. But it wasn't just the changing environment that posed a threat. The young dinosaurs also began to encounter new predators, creatures unlike any they had faced before. The land that had once been dominated by familiar threats, fast-moving carnivores, cunning ambush predators, and territorial rivals, was now home to new and more dangerous creatures. These new predators were bigger, stronger, and more aggressive, their hunting strategies more sophisticated and terrifying. The first of these new predators appeared suddenly, a massive, armoured creature that seemed to move effortlessly through the dense underbrush. The young dinosaurs, still in the process of adapting to the new environment, were caught off guard. The creature was unlike anything they had seen before. Its tough, scaled hide was nearly impenetrable, and its massive jaws could crush bones with ease. It was a creature built for war, its body designed for combat, and it moved with terrifying precision. The young dinosaurs, despite their strength and cunning, were no match for it. The first encounter with this new predator was a brutal awakening. The young dinosaurs were not yet prepared for the challenges that this creature presented. It was a reminder that the world was always changing, that new threats were always rising, and that survival was never guaranteed. The predator attacked swiftly, using its powerful jaws to strike at the young dinosaurs. The group scattered in panic, their instincts kicking in as they ran for their lives. The predator, however, was relentless. It chased them with a speed and precision that left them no room to escape. The young dinosaurs had to rely on their newfound strength, their knowledge of the terrain, and their quick thinking to evade the predator. They learned to use the environment to their advantage, darting between trees, leaping over obstacles, and diving into dense underbrush to hide from the predator's gaze. It was a terrifying experience, one that would shape their understanding of the dangers that surrounded them. They realized that the world was no longer a place of simple survival, it was a place of constant battle, where only the strongest and most adaptable could survive. After the initial shock of the encounter, the young dinosaurs regrouped. They learned quickly from their experience. The predator had tested their limits, but they had also learned valuable lessons. They realized that the world was no longer a predictable place. The creatures they once knew had been replaced by more dangerous, unpredictable forces. To survive, they would need to be more vigilant, more strategic, and more adaptable than ever before. The battle for survival had evolved, and they were now part of a new, much more dangerous world. Over time, the young dinosaurs learned to work together in the face of these new threats. They began to coordinate their movements, using their strength and numbers to outwit and evade predators. They also learned to track the movements of their new enemies, using the signs in the environment, the tracks in the mud, the broken branches, the scent trails, to anticipate the predator's next move. They learned to read the signs of danger before it was too late, to adapt to the shifting threats of the world around them. But even as they became more skilled at navigating the dangers of their world, the young dinosaurs began to realize that the true threat was not just the predators that stalked them, but the very land itself. The environmental changes that had begun as subtle shifts had now become full-scale transformations. The land they had once known was no longer recognizable, and they were forced to adapt to an entirely new landscape. The once thriving forests, which had provided shelter and food, were now slowly disappearing, replaced by barren plains and treacherous swamps. The rivers that had once provided fresh water were now choked with debris and sediment, and the animals that had once grazed in the open fields were now migrating farther and farther away. The land was becoming hostile, and the young dinosaurs had to adjust to the new world they inhabited. This new reality forced the young dinosaurs to develop new survival strategies. They learned to conserve energy during the hot summer months, finding shelter during the heat of the day, and only venturing out at dawn or dusk when the temperatures were cooler. They adapted their diets, learning to eat new plants and to hunt different prey as the available food sources dwindled. They began to understand that survival in this new world would require constant vigilance, constant adaptation. The gathering storm of change was not just about the rise of new threats. It was about the realization that survival in a constantly changing world meant that nothing could ever be taken for granted. The young dinosaurs were no longer the helpless hatchlings they had once been. They were powerful creatures, capable of facing the dangers that the world threw at them. But they also understood that their strength alone would not be enough. To survive, they had to adapt, to grow, and to evolve alongside the ever-changing world around them. And so the young dinosaurs moved forward into the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. the gathering storm was far from over. New threats, both from the environment and from other creatures, would continue to rise. But the dinosaurs had learned the most important lesson of all, that survival was a constant process of adaptation, and only the strongest and most adaptable would survive. As the seasons grew harsher, and the threats of their environment became increasingly apparent, the young dinosaurs began to sense that their time in the familiar territories of their birth was nearing its end. The land had grown increasingly unforgiving. The lush forests where they once played had been replaced by barren stretches of land and dense swamps that hindered their movement. Water sources were scarce, the food was dwindling, and the predators had grown more aggressive. The dinosaurs could no longer rely on the comforts of home. It was time for the Great Migration. The young dinosaurs had heard whispers of this migration in the murmurs of their elders, tales of vast journeys across unknown landscapes, where herds moved together, guided by instincts they did not fully understand. The migration was not just a physical journey, it was a rite of passage, a test of their strength, their survival skills, and their ability to adapt. The young dinosaurs, now strong and capable, were ready to face this new chapter of their lives. They knew that their survival depended not just on their strength, but on their ability to move with the earth, to follow the natural rhythms of the land and find new places to live. The migration began as the first signs of the season shifted. The ground beneath their feet felt different, harder, more unforgiving. The sky, too, seemed to be changing, with dark clouds gathering in the distance, heralding the coming of another storm. The herds began to move, not in a panic, but with purpose. The mothers led their young, guiding them across the increasingly hostile landscape. The young dinosaurs, still growing but no longer fragile, followed the elders, learning how to navigate the world with new eyes. They had to learn to rely on each other, to stay in line, and to move swiftly across the land. The journey was not easy. The dinosaurs encountered countless challenges along the way. They had to cross treacherous rivers, their currents strong enough to sweep even the strongest of them away. They moved through dense forests where the trees grew so thick they could barely see the sky above. They faced days of hunger, with little food to be found, and nights of exhaustion, as their bodies, still growing and adapting, demanded rest. But they pushed on, driven by a single instinct: the need to survive, to find a new place where life could flourish. As the herd moved forward, the young dinosaurs began to understand that the migration was not just about moving from one place to another, it was about survival on a grand scale. It was about the herds coming together, not just as a group of individuals, but as a collective force. They moved in unison, their movements synchronized, as though they were part of something larger than themselves. The migration was a journey of cooperation, of understanding that each member of the herd had a role to play in the survival of the whole. The strongest moved at the front, leading the way, while the younger dinosaurs followed closely behind, protected and guided by the older, wiser members of the group. The young dinosaurs were not yet leaders in the migration. They followed, learning, observing, and adapting to the challenges of the journey. They learned how to conserve their energy, to find shelter when storms rolled in, and to recognize the signs of danger when predators lurked nearby. The migration taught them the importance of pacing themselves, of knowing when to push forward and when to rest. The herd moved together, a living, breathing organism, each part contributing to the success of the whole. The migration also brought the young dinosaurs into contact with other species. The land was not just inhabited by their own kind, but by countless other creatures, each with its own place in the ecosystem. The young dinosaurs learned that the world was full of diverse life, and they had to navigate the relationships between different species with caution. Some species were friends, others were rivals, and some were predators. the young dinosaurs learned to read the signs of other creatures, how to tell if another species was a threat or if it was a potential ally. One of the most significant challenges of the migration was the crossing of the vast open plains. The land stretched out before the herd like a never-ending sea of grass and dirt. The journey was long and tiring, but the young dinosaurs could feel the power of the herd as they moved together. They were no longer the fragile creatures they had once been. They were becoming strong, resilient beings capable of facing the challenges of the wild. The young dinosaurs could feel the weight of history in the air, the legacy of their species moving forward as they took each step across the plains. They were part of a cycle that had been going on for millions of years, a cycle that would continue long after they were gone. The young dinosaurs also began to realize that the migration was not just a physical journey, it was a journey of transformation. As they moved across the land, they were changing in ways they hadn't anticipated. They were becoming stronger, more capable, and more attuned to the rhythms of the earth. The migration was shaping them, moulding them into creatures capable of surviving in an ever-changing world. They were learning to read the land, to understand its signs, to move with it, and to find their place within it. But the migration was not without its dangers. Along the way, the young dinosaurs encountered new predators, creatures they had never seen before, their strength and ferocity unmatched. The predators stalked the herd from the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The young dinosaurs had to learn quickly how to recognize the signs of danger, how to read the subtle cues of the predators around them. They learned how to stay close to the herd, how to move quickly when the predators attacked, and how to use their environment to escape danger. In one of the most intense moments of the migration, the herd was ambushed by a group of massive carnivorous predators. The attack came suddenly, without warning. The young dinosaurs, still learning the ways of the world, were caught off guard. Panic spread through the herd as the predators closed in, but the young dinosaurs had learned the importance of cooperation. They rallied together, using their newfound strength to fight back against the predators. The battle was fierce, but the herd emerged victorious, having successfully defended themselves against the attack. The young dinosaurs, now more aware of their power, realized that survival was not just about avoiding danger. It was about standing together, fighting back when the time came, and protecting each other. As the migration continued, the young dinosaurs felt the weight of their journey. They were no longer the fragile creatures they had once been. They were becoming powerful, adaptable beings capable of surviving in an ever-changing world. The migration had transformed them, had taught them the value of cooperation, and had prepared them for the challenges of the future. They had moved with the earth, followed its rhythms, and had learned that survival was a constant process of adaptation. At the end of the journey, the herd reached a new land, a place where the seasons were kinder, where the food was plentiful, and where the dangers were fewer. The young dinosaurs, now stronger and more capable, took their place in this new world. The migration had been a rite of passage, a test of their strength, resilience, and adaptability. They had faced the challenges of the wild, had survived, and had emerged as creatures capable of thriving in the ever-changing world that surrounded them. As the young dinosaurs adapted to their new environment, the world around them seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The harsh trials of the migration were behind them, and they now lived in a land rich with resource. The plains stretched wide and fertile before them, filled with lush vegetation, grazing herds, and crystal-clear rivers. For a while it seemed as though peace had finally returned. The young dinosaurs, now strong and wise beyond their years, flourished in the new land. Their bonds with the herd grew even stronger, their roles more defined. But as they thrived, the world was changing once again, this time in a way that no one could have predicted. The world that the dinosaurs had long dominated was on the cusp of transformation. The days of giants, of powerful herds and sweeping migrations were numbered. The Earth itself, once a cradle of life for the dinosaurs, was slowly becoming inhospitable. This was a time of endings, of the decline of an era that had reigned for millions of years. It began subtly at first. The once vibrant forests filled with towering tree and lush underbrush began to wither. The climate shifted, growing harsher. The once predictable seasons became erratic. Sudden shifts in temperature, intense storms, and longer, colder winters began to take their toll on the land. The dinosaurs, though strong, could not escape the growing pressures of a changing world. The younger generations, those born into the new land, were not aware of the time that had passed before them. They were accustomed to the land being plentiful and the herds roaming freely across the plains. They didn't know that this world had once been dominated by ancient giants who roamed the land unchallenged. They didn't understand the slow erosion of the world beneath their feet, the subtle changes that were beginning to alter the very fabric of the Earth itself. The first signs of what would become an inevitable shift in the balance of life came with the disappearance of some of the larger herds. As the seasons grew colder and the food became scarcer, many of the giant creatures that had once roamed freely began to struggle. Their massive bodies, though built for power and endurance, could not sustain the growing pressures of the changing world. They became slower, weaker, and less able to find the resources they needed. The great herds, once a symbol of the dinosaurs' dominance, began to dwindle. The giants who had once ruled the plains, massive creatures whose very presence had shaped the landscape, began to fall. This was not a sudden event, but rather the slow, inevitable fading of an era. The young dinosaurs watched as these great creatures, their elders and ancestors, began to disappear from the land. The massive plant eaters, who had once filled the plains with their mighty presence, were no longer seen in the numbers they had once been. The giants were falling not through battle or predation, but through the slow and inexorable change of the world itself. For the young dinosaurs, this was a moment of profound realization. They had known the giants as symbols of strength, as the great figures that defined the land they lived in. But as the giants disappeared, the young dinosaurs realized that no creature, no matter how mighty, was immune to the forces of nature. The fall of the giants was not just a loss of the creatures themselves. It was a symbol of the inevitable decline of an entire era. The world they had known was disappearing. The younger dinosaurs, who had once been taught to follow the example of the giants, now had to learn how to adapt to a world that was increasingly uncertain. The herds that had once moved in synchrony across the land now seemed more fractured, more vulnerable. The predators too began to feel the effects of the changing environment. They could no longer rely on the abundance of prey that had once been so plentiful. Food became harder to find, and the once balanced ecosystem began to shift in unpredictable ways. As the dinosaurs watched the slow disappearance of the giants, they realized that the balance they had known for so long was no longer certain. The landscape they had known, the vast plains and dense forests, was becoming an alien place, one that was increasingly hostile to the creatures that had once thrived within it. The young dinosaurs understood that they too would have to evolve. They would have to adapt, just as the giants had adapted once, to survive in this new world. But the disappearance of the giants wasn't just a loss of creatures, it was a loss of a way of life that had dominated the earth for millions of years. The giants had shaped the land, carved out paths through the forests, and created ecosystems that the dinosaurs had relied on. With their passing, the very foundation of the earth itself was changing. As the younger generations learned to navigate this changing world, they were forced to confront the inevitability of their own mortality. They could no longer take for granted that the world would remain as it had been, that the giants would continue to roam the plains, and that the seasons would always be predictable. The fall of the giants was a stark reminder that the Earth was constantly evolving, and that no species, no matter how powerful, was guaranteed a place in the future. The young dinosaurs, who had once seen the giants as invincible, now understood that all things, great and small, had their time. The end of the giants marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new one. The young dinosaurs, now aware of the fragility of life, began to adapt in ways they never had before. They learned to rely on their intelligence, their agility, and their ability to cooperate in ways that they had not fully appreciated. The fall of the giants was a painful lesson, but it was also a necessary one. It taught the young dinosaurs that survival was not just about strength, it was about adaptability. It was about learning to thrive in a world that was constantly changing and understanding that even the most powerful creatures could not escape the forces of nature. The giants had fallen, but life would continue. The young dinosaurs would carry on, and in time they too would become the giants of the Earth. As the seasons continued to change, the Earth shifted beneath their feet, but the legacy of the giants lived on in the bones buried deep beneath the soil. The younger generations would not forget the lessons they had learned from their elders. The fall of the giants had taught them that nothing in the natural world was permanent, that life was cyclical, and that the true measure of strength was the ability to survive and adapt. They would carry those lessons forward into the future, ensuring that the cycle of life continued, even as the Earth changed once again. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the land. The once bustling world of towering trees, open plains, and lush forests was slowly fading into a distant memory. The once vibrant Earth, full of life and teeming with creatures of all shapes and sizes, was now quiet. The world that had been the domain of dinosaurs for millions of years was nearing its end. The last dinosaurs, those who had survived countless dangers and adapted to changing environments, now faced the reality of their own extinction. The great battle for survival that had defined their lives was slowly winding down, and the dinosaurs, now older and weary from the long journey, could feel the weight of time pressing on them. They had lived through the rise and fall of generations, through the ebb and flow of seasons, through the unrelenting challenges of a constantly changing world. But now, the time had come for them to face the inevitable, the end of an era. The last dinosaurs moved slowly across the landscape, their once strong bodies now showing the wear and tear of years spent fighting for survival. The once mighty herds were fragmented, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were aware that their time was running out. The once vibrant world that had once thrived with life now seemed eerily quiet. The sounds of roaring predators, the calls of herding dinosaurs, and the rustling of trees had all faded into the background, replaced by the ominous stillness of the end. The land, too, seemed to sense the inevitable. The once lush forests were now sparse and brittle. The rivers that had once flowed freely were now little more than trickles, and the plains, once teeming with life, had turned dry and barren. The earth was changing, becoming less hospitable to the creatures that had once ruled it. The great migration, the search for new territory, had led them to this point, the final stretch of their long journey. The world that they had known, the world of their ancestors, was fading, and with it the giants of the past. The younger dinosaurs, those who had grown up in the shadow of these once mighty creatures, could feel the change. They had learned the ways of the world, the rhythms of the seasons, the language of survival. But they too knew that the world they had once known was slipping away. They had witnessed the fall of the giants, the extinction of entire species, and the slow fading of the environment that had once supported them. They knew that they could not escape the cycle of life and death that governed the natural world. But in these final days there was no panic, no sense of chaos. The dinosaurs, now fully aware of the fragility of life, had learned to accept the inevitability of their fate. They had lived through countless trials, and now, as they faced the end, they approached it with the same quiet strength that had defined their existence. The last dinosaurs, though few in number, continued to move across the land, searching for food, water and shelter, just as they always had. But now their movements were slower, more deliberate, as if they understood that the end was near. The skies, once a constant backdrop to their world, seemed to change as well. The once blue skies had turned an unsettling shade of grey, the clouds darker and heavier than ever before. The air, once filled with the sounds of life, now felt thick with an impending sense of finality. The last dinosaurs, sensing the change in the air, paused in their tracks, their instincts telling them that something was different, something was coming. The winds whispered through the barren trees, carrying with them the scent of dust and ash, as though the earth itself was preparing for the inevitable. For the dinosaurs there was no great battle to fight, no final stand to be made. Their time had simply come. The earth was changing and they could not stop it. The forces that had shaped their world, the same forces that had allowed them to thrive for millions of years, were now working against them. The dinosaurs, no matter how strong or resilient, were no longer suited to the world they inhabited. The ecosystems that had supported them were collapsing, and the world they had once known was slipping away. As the last dinosaurs continued to move across the land, they came to a quiet realization. They were no longer the rulers of the earth. The earth had changed, and with it the balance of life. The predators that had once threatened them, the great giants that had roamed the plains, and the ecosystems that had supported them were all part of a world that was now fading into history. The last dinosaurs had become part of the past, their legacy etched in the fossil record for future generations to study and wonder at. And yet there was a quiet dignity in their final days. The dinosaurs, though nearing the end of their existence, had lived lives full of purpose, strength and resilience. They had adapted to a changing world, learned from the struggles of the past, and passed on their knowledge to the next generation. They had faced every challenge head-on, never wavering in their commitment to survival. And in the end, they did not go out with a roar, but with a quiet acceptance of their place in the natural order of things. As the final days of the dinosaurs stretched on, the last members of the herd continued their journey, their steps slow and measured. The sun set on the horizon, casting a soft, golden light across the land. The world around them, though quieter than it had ever been, was still beautiful, still full of life. And in that moment, the dinosaurs, though they knew their time was coming to an end, understood that their legacy would live on. The Earth, though it had changed, would continue to evolve just as it always had. The last dinosaurs, once the giants of the Earth, faded into history, leaving behind only their bones, their footprints, and the echoes of their existence. Their time had come to an end, but their legacy would live on in the world they had shaped. The Earth, though forever changed, would continue its slow, relentless march forward, carrying with it the memories of those who had come before. And as the dinosaurs faded into the past, the Earth carried on, its story continuing long after the last dinosaur had walked its lands.